Welcome, dreamers, to another journey through time's hidden corridors. I am your guide through the dreaming historian, where ancient mysteries whisper their secrets to those who dare to listen. Tonight, we voyage to the distant shores of the Aegean Sea, to an island kissed by warm winds and cradled by time, where the Minoans once danced in temples and painted their palaces in colors still radiant with wonder. But in the quiet shadow of a volcanic roar, their world fell silent. Before we drift deeper into this tale, gently let your presence be known with a like, and join our circle of dreamers by subscribing for more nightly journeys into history's forgotten realms. Now, close your eyes, dear listener, and let the ancient voices of Thera and Crete guide you into peaceful contemplation. Beneath the restless blue of the Aegean Sea lies an echo subtle and persistent, like the murmur of forgotten prayers carried on the tide. It is not a voice that shouts, but one that hums low in the bones of the earth, as if the very seabed remembers a time when islands trembled and the heavens turned to ash. This is the whisper of Thera, the beginning of a silence. We begin not with the fall, but with the stillness that preceded it, a world of elegance and ritual, laughter in courtyards and songs, two distant stars. A world ruled not by war, but by rhythm of tide, of harvest, of sacred dance. This was the world of the men. On the island of Crete, they flourished like springtime incarnate, blooming with artistry, trade, and mystery. And yet, not far to the north, a caldera stood, sleeping guard in the form of an island, known today as Santorini, but once as Thera. Thera was beautiful. She was crowned with olive groves, her villages brushed against cliffs that fell into sapphire waters, but she was also built on a trembling heart. Deep beneath her surface, magma pooled and pulsed with ancient intent. Centuries before her fury, the Minoans had already woven a world that defied what many thought possible for the Bronze Age. The palace rose in tiers of light and labyrinth, where frescoes of blue dolphins leapt joyfully across walls and priestesses danced in bright linen above altars of polished stone. They had script lineae yet to be. They had trade routes that reached as far as Egypt and Mesopotamia. They had plumbing, architecture, frescoes that still seemed to breathe. And they had no walls. Unlike the Mycenaeans of the mainland, the Minoans built not for war, but for wonder. Their cities were open, their temples spacious. They welcomed the world across the waves. Their power, it seemed, came not from sword or spear but from the mystery of their order, their peace, their connection to the divine. And perhaps it was that openness that would become their undoing. Thera began her quiet unrest perhaps years before the final eruption. Earthquakes danced through the southern Aegean like warnings in the deep. Tremors shook the foundations of homes. The sea behaved strangely, and birds fled from the forests of Crete. But such signs are often written in hindsight. For the Minoans, life continued. They rebuilt. They repainted. It is possible they thought Thera had quieted, that her anger had passed. But the fire below had only begun to gather breath. By the time the final explosion came, it was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Modern volcanologists estimate that the eruption of Thera was one of the most powerful in human history, 4 times more forceful than Krakatoa. The entire center of the island disappeared, leaving a caldera that filled with sea. The sky turned black, ash reigned over thousands of miles. Tsunamis rose like sleeping giants disturbed in their slumber and raced toward Crete. And yet, in the moment, there would have been no epic narration, no scream across the heavens, only the sound of the wind, the ocean receding, and then rising again with a roar that swallowed coasts and cities alike. The port towns of the Minoans were vulnerable. Their ships' symbols of prosperity were shattered against rocks or pulled out to sea. Inland the earth trembled, palaces cracked, storage jars fell, and labyrinthine halls turned to broken stone. But the story is not simply one of destruction. What followed was stranger. 4 Knossos stood. Crete endured. The Minoans, for a time, survived. And this is where the mystery deepens. Archaeology suggests that the eruption itself did not immediately wipe out Minoan civilization. Instead, it wounded it deeply. Crops failed under ash-filled skies. Trade was disrupted. Religious life, so central to their society, may have collapsed in doubt and confusion. The goddess no longer answered, and into that spiritual and economic vacuum, others crept. Mainland Mycenaeans, with their more militaristic culture, began to appear in Minoan sites in the generations after the eruption. They may have offered help, or conquest, or both. We do not know precisely what the Minoans felt, or believed, or whispered in those nights when their world shifted from confidence to uncertainty. We can only imagine. Imagine a priestess of Knossos standing before a cracked altar, incense trailing into a darkened sky, asking the gods why the sea had risen to take their temples. Imagine a merchant staring at the empty horizon where once ships brought gold and cinnamon. Imagine the silence of a people slowly forgetting how to dance. The fall of the Minoans was not sudden, but suffused with shadow. It was a slow exhale, a fading echo, and beneath that echo, always, is Thera. Beneath the caldera the sea still trembles. Divers descend to find the ghost city of buried in pumice, but preserved in details so vivid it might have been abandoned only yesterday. Pots still sit on shelves. Murals still show boys boxing, antelope leaping, women with curled black hair tending to mysteries we can only guess at. The people of Thera left no bones. No bodies have ever been found in Akrotiri. Did they flee? Did they vanish into myth? And so, the whispers return. Whispers of a civilization whose elegance rivaled later empires, whose fall left no war cry, only ruin and silence. Some say Plato's Atlantis was inspired by their memory. Others say the gods took them because they flew too close to sacred flame. Whatever the truth, the Minoans and the people of Thera remain as shadows beneath ash, their stories incomplete. And tonight, we begin our descent into that quiet Abustu. Follow the ash trail, to breathe the incense of Knossos, and to listen for the heartbeat beneath the sea. Let us journey now to the palace of Knossos itself, and step into its labyrinth of mystery. In the soft twilight of Crete's hills, where olive trees sway in rhythm with the Aegean wind, there rises a place more dream than ruined Knossos. Not a fortress, not a tomb, but a palace of memory, where sunlight once danced across polished stones, and ritual echoed through painted halls. This is not merely architecture, it is a labyrinth of soul. Even in its crumbled state, Knossos stirs something deep in the dreaming mind. Walk its ancient paths, and you will feel the presence of something sacred and enduring, as though the stone itself remembers. At the heart of Minoan civilization, Knossos was more than a royal seat. It was a symbol of harmony, of ritual, of cosmic balance. The myths that later Greeks would whisper of Theseus, of Daedalus and Icarus all find their shadows here, in the twisting corridors and sacred chambers of this palace. But the real mystery may be even greater than the legend. For Knossos was a marvel of design. Its walls were decorated with vibrant frescoes, blue monkeys from distant lands, red lilies bursting with life, young men leaping over bulls and feats of sacred courage. It had plumbing systems more advanced than many medieval cities. Light wells flooded the interior with natural radiance. Storerooms held amphorae brimming with oil, wine, and grain, enough to feed multitudes. And the structure itself, it was vast, seemingly without beginning or end. A true labyrinth, not one of terror, but of transformation. Unlike the gloomy castles of later warlords, Knossos welcomed the sun. Its builders channeled light like an offering. Spaces were designed to invite illumination, to allow the divine to dance among the columns. Light and shadow played together here, each revealing something the other could not. It is no wonder, then, that the myth of the Minotaur took root in such a place. The story, as told by the later Greeks, is of a monstrous beast hidden within the labyrinth, a punishment for the sins of kings. But what if the truth was more symbolic than monstrous? Some scholars believe the labyrinth was never meant to trap, but to guide, a sacred passage, a ritual path. The Minotaur, half man and half beast, may not have been a creature of flesh, but of spirit, a representation of the dual nature within all who walked its twisting halls. To walk the labyrinth was not to face death, but to encounter oneself. Perhaps it was the Minoan priestesses, not Greek heroes, who walked these paths. Perhaps the bull was not an enemy to be slain, but a sacred symbol of strength, of fertility. Indeed, the bull appears again and again in Minoan iconography, not with fear, but with reverence. The famous fresco of the Bulippers, midair in graceful arcs, suggests celebration rather than slaughter. But what happened to these rituals after the ash began to fall? Did the labyrinth fall silent? Or did those who still remained walk it in grief, seeking answers from the gods who once danced in their temples? In the years after the Thera eruption, archaeologists have found signs that Knossos was re-inhabited, rebuilt, reused. But the frescoes change. The colors dim. The symbols shift. Some believe the Mycenaeans arrived, bringing with them new gods, new hierarchies, new fears. The great throne room of Knossos, once a chamber of ceremonial grace, begins to take on a different tone. The throne itself, carved into alabaster, sits low and wide, almost feminine, Some suggest it belonged not to a king, but to a high priestess, to a woman who spoke for the divine. But in later years, that voice may have been silenced. Ritual gives way to rule. Openness becomes guarded, and the labyrinth that once welcomed light becomes a maze of fading echoes. Still, the palace endured, even after the ash and the quakes, even after the seas pulled back their trade and the stars no longer aligned as they once had. But a palace is only sacred when its people give it soul. And as Minoan society thinned, as its dancers vanished and its incense cooled, Knossos became a ghost with open eyes. Visitors today often speak of the strange stillness there, not haunted, not foreboding, but suspended, as if the palace is listening, as if it remembers the rhythms of drums and bare feet, as if it waits. In the silence of these ruins, one might hear the last song of a civilization that chose harmony over conquest, art over arms, and ritual over rule. What wisdom did they leave behind in these spiraling halls? What stories lie hidden in the untranslated script of Lineare, etched into clay with hands that trembled, not with war, but with worship? We do not know. We only walk in circles, as if within a labyrinth of time. From Knossos, let us now turn our gaze seaward, to the mighty ships and maritime spirit that once defined Minoan reach. For while the land held their temples, the ocean carried their soul. Close your eyes and drift with me, dreamer, beyond the Cretan shore. Let the wind lift your spirit across the waters once charted by sails of linen and hulls of cedar. Imagine a horizon where the sun slips into an indigo sea, and from it rise the silent silhouettes of ships graceful, awed, and proud. These were not vessels of war, but of wonder. The Minoans, it is said, were the first to give the sea a soul. Theirs was a civilization defined not by walls but by waves, long before the Mycenaeans raised their stone citadels or the Greeks inscribed their epics. The Minoans had carved the Mediterranean into a web of connection. From Crete, they set sail to the Levant, to Egypt, to Anatolia, even perhaps as far west as Iberia. No iron weapon carved their empire, it was the wind, and their ships so slender and swift, painted with flowing patterns and crowned with banners that fluttered like whispers. The prows were sometimes carved with bull horns or birds, symbols of their sacred world. Each journey was more than commerce, it was a ritual, for the sea was not a mere path but a presence. They knew its moods, its breath, its silence. They called upon the gods before each voyage. Amphorae were packed with oil and wine, lapis and saffron, cedarwood and obsidian. And as the oars dipped in rhythm, they sang songs lost to time, carried away on the same breezes that once filled their sails. Maritime frescoes discovered in places like Akrotiri depict flotillas, crossing azure waters, adorned with garlands, surrounded by dolphins. It was not only trade, it was celebration, a communion with the blue expanse that gave life and demanded reverence. But Thera changed everything. When the island exploded, it was not just land that fractured, but memory itself. Tsunamis rose in silence, then thundered against Crete's northern harbors. Whole fleets may have been swallowed. Ports, once vibrant with barter and incense, fell silent under waves and ash. The lifeblood of Minoan society, its maritime soul, was torn asunder. Yet the mystery deepens. For some years after Thera's fury, the Minoans still sent ships to sea. They repaired what they could. The pottery styles evolved, suggesting adaptation, resilience. But something in the rhythm was lost. Perhaps it was the loss of Akrotiri, their jewel of the north, that fractured their network. Akrotiri had been a sister to Knossos, a place of art and alignment, of shared belief. Its burial on ash was not just a disaster, it was a Still, some believe a great exodus occurred, that before the final eruption, the people of Thera took to their ships and vanished. No bodies have been found in the ruins, no skeletons among the homes. It is as if they were warned, as if the sea called them away in time. Where did they go? Did they seek refuge on Crete, or farther still? And in that wandering, another myth rises from the from Atlantis. Plato would later write of a great civilization that ruled the seas, was rich beyond imagining, and fell in a single day of fire and flood. A poetic memory, perhaps, of Thera and the myth. But more than myth, there is a spiritual resonance. Atlantis was a society out of balance. The Minoans, it seems, sought balance in all things. They honored the sea. They flowed with nature. Their downfall was not moral corruption, but cosmic tragedy. Still, the legend lingers, perhaps because the sea remembers. Even today, divers in the Aegean find traces of ports, anchor stones, and harbors buried beneath sediment, silent relics of a once vibrant maritime tapestry. To float above them is to drift above dreams. The Minoan sailors, their prayers long since quieted, still seem to move in the currents. Each wave that touches Crete's shores carries a whisper of their longing, their skill, and perhaps it was that surrender, not failure, that defined them. They did not conquer the sea. They danced with it. They understood what later empires would forget, that the sea is not to be mastered, but listened to. And now, let us follow their path inland, once more, into the sacred spaces where sea and sky met in ceremony. For the Minoans built more than palaces built sanctuaries to the divine breath of the world, high in the hills where the air grows thin and the earth seems to lean closer to the sky. The Minoans built their temples not in towering ziggurats or shadowed cathedrals, but in harmony with the world's breath. These were sanctuaries of wind and flame, places where divinity was not summoned down from above, but awakened from within the stones, the breeze, and the flickering torch. Unlike later civilizations that enclosed their gods in chambers of secrecy, the Minoans sought communion in openness. Their sacred spaces speak sanctuaries and cave shrines. They allowed the morning sun to spill across the altar, the mountain wind to carry the smoke of incense into the heavens, the rain to purify the stones of offering. This was not worship born of fear, but of reverent participation in the rhythms of the natural world. The peak sanctuary at Mount Juctus is one such place, a place of awe and stillness. It overlooks the palace of Knossos, as though the mountain itself kept watch over the city's heart. Here, among shattered figurines and scattered libation tables, the Minoans once offered tokens of devotion, small clay models of animals, humans, and divine figures, placed with care among the rocks. The sacred was not grandiose, but intimate, personal, embodied. Below ground, too, the Minoans sought the divine in caves such as Psychro and Skut, dripping sanctuaries where the earth opened its mouth and whispered secrets in the dark. These were not places of dread, but of descent. The womb of Gaia, the inner spiral. Torches flickered against damp walls, revealing stalactites like frozen fire. Offerings were left in silence, and perhaps, sometimes, songs were sung in the echoing dark, songs not meant for human ears alone. What we now understand as religion was not separate from life for the Minoans. It was life. The line between sacred and daily experience was thin, if it existed at all. Women played prominent roles in ritual. The frescoes show them not as attendants but as central figures, priestesses with flowing robes, holding sacred objects, painted with confidence and grace. Their gods remain elusive to us. There is no pantheon written in stone, no mythos preserved in epic, but the iconography speaks. The snake goddess, holding serpents in both hands, her chest bare, her gaze steady, she is both creation and power, healer and oracle. The double axe, or labyrinth, a symbol found again and again, perhaps representing not war but transformation. The cutting of veils, the opening of doors, and fire. Fire was more than warmth or light. It was the breath of the divine. Fires were kept in sacred hearths, not to destroy, but to consecrate, to light the path between the seen and the unseen. When the sky darkened after Thera, when ash dimmed the sun and tremors shook the altars loose from their foundations, one must imagine the Minoans gathering in these places, not to flee, but to understand, to seek meaning, to offer their fears and prayers into the wind and flame. Did the gods answer, or was the silence itself the answer? The archaeological layers suggest continuity. Worship did not cease, but the artifacts grow more fragmented, the symbols more obscure. The clarity of ritual fades into the mists of change, and with it, something else begins to stir. As trade withers and harvests fail, as sacred rhythms fall out of step, belief bends, not all at once, slowly, like a temple eroded by time and salt air. And into this spiritual erosion, a new presence enters. They come with different gods, different songs, different meanings for fire and stone. Some say they conquered, others say they integrated, but either way, the flame shifts. Still, in the high hills of Crete, the wind carries something older. It murmurs through broken sanctuaries. It whines between the stones of It speaks in a voice too soft for history to record, but clear enough for the dreaming soul to sense. A voice that says, "We were here, once, when the earth breathed gently, and time moved in spirals, Let us now journey deeper into this spiral, not above, but below, into the sacred cavern where the Minoans met, the underworld not with fear, but with offerings and open hands. Now let us descend, dreamer not into fear, but into stillness. Imagine the cool breath of stone against your skin, the dim flicker of torchlight casting long shadows on dripping walls. Here, beneath the surface of Crete, the Minoans entered the deep chambers of the earth not to escape the world above, but to return to something older, something eternal, a sacred womb from which life and death alike emerged. The caves of Crete are more than geological marvels. They are thresholds. To the Minoans, these places were not realms of terror, but of renewal. They were the dwelling places of ancient power, the breath of the goddess, the bones of time. In the cave, one was not buried but reborn. One met the divine not in brilliance, but in the hush. The most revered of these was the cave of Psychro, perched high upon the Lacythi plateau. Known later as the Dictaean cave, it would be wrapped in myth by the Greeks, said to be the birthplace of Zeus himself. But long before that name was spoken, the Minoans had already known this cave as sacred. They left behind hundreds of offerings, figurines of humans and animals, bronze, blades, rings, and delicate pottery carefully placed as if in conversation with a living stone. The cave opened in a mouth of moss and rock, then descended steeply into chambers veiled in silence. Pools of water glistened in torchlight, stalactites reached down like frozen roots. The earth itself seemed to pulse with memory. One can imagine the procession, priests and priestesses in white and red, descending into the depths with slow, deliberate steps, carrying oil lamps and libations. The silence was not empty, it was sacred. Each footstep echoed like a chant. Each offering was a bridge across time. Here, the Minoans communed with what they could not see but deeply felt. Life, they believed, emerged from darkness, and so it was to the darkness they returned to offer thanks, to ask guidance, to mourn and remember. The rituals of the cave may have followed the seasons, spring offerings for new life, autumn rites for harvests, and the rhythms mirrored the body, the earth, the stars. All connected, all returning. What was spoken in those subterranean halls, we do not know, but the fragments they left behind suggest reverence, not dread. The figurines are not of monsters, but of dancers. Not of fear, but of grace. There are no iron chains, no skulls, no signs of torment. Only the slow unfolding of presence. And yet, after Thera's eruption, the tone shifts. Offerings in some caves increase, perhaps, a sign of desperation. Other caves fall into silence. The balance between world and underworld falters. The breath of the goddess, once steady, seems distant. Still, the memory endures. Even centuries later, when the Greeks arrived with their own gods, they chose these same caves as sacred. They sensed what the Minoans had known, that beneath the surface of the world lies a wisdom beyond language, a place of surrender. Today, those who visit Psychro or Scutano still speak of a hush that falls as they enter, a weightless solemnity, a presence, and perhaps, if you stand very still in those echoing halls, you might feel it too, the warmth of an ancient hand against yours, the breath of the earth rising to meet your own, the unspoken lullaby of the first dreamers. From the depths, let us now rise. Above us, the island of Thera still shudders in memory, its crater a wound and a warning. Let us return now to that island not as tourers, but as seekers in, to the ruins of a city buried in silence yet preserved in astonishing clarity. Imagine, dear dreamer, walking through a city that has not breathed in over 3,000 years, yet lies so perfectly preserved that its walls still cradle color, its stairways still lead upward, and its silence still listens. This is beneath a quiet crust of volcanic ash on the island now known as Santorini, the ancient city of Akrotiri slumbers. She does not lie in ruin, but in stillness entombed, yet untouched. A moment, frozen mid a city stopped not by war or fire, but by the most mysterious silence of all, absence. The volcano we now call Thera erupted with unfathomable force sometime around 1600 BCE, unleashing one of the greatest cataclysms the ancient world had ever known. But long before that final, shattering moment, something remarkable happened. The people of Akrotiri left. There are no bodies in the ash, no skeletons buried under fallen roofs, no scenes of panic preserved like those in Pompeii, only rooms meticulously emptied, valuables taken, doorways open, streets swept clean. It is as though the city gently exhaled and stepped away. How did they know? We may never know. But it seems the people of Akrotiri heeded something that later cities would not. They listened, and so, they vanished. But the city they left behind remains as a miracle of memory. Step with me now into these silent streets. The homes rise 2 and 3 stories high, painted in reds and golds, blues and creams. The walls breathe with murals, young women gathering saffron, fishermen hauling their glittering catch, ships sailing past flowering islands. Not merely decoration, these paintings are prayers in pigment, testaments of a people who lived in joy, in connection, in rhythm with the sea and sky. The furnishings remain low: wooden beds, stone basins, ceramic ovens, jars for oil and wine, tables laid with bowls. Everyday life paused like a held breath. Akrotiri shows us that the Minoan world extended far beyond Crete. This was a satellite city, but with a soul of its own. The art here is local, yet deeply connected to Cretan ritual and style. The goddess is present. The bowl still leaps, the sea still sings, and though Thera destroyed her body, it could not erase her spirit. The ash that fell thick, suffocating, suffused with fire preserved what time would have devoured. Because of that ash, we can walk today in the shadows of Akrotiri and see, not ruins, but memory made solid. There is something profoundly contemplative in this. We often imagine the past as decayed, unknowable, distant, but here, the past is close. It breathes just beneath the dust. Each room speaks. Each wall whispers. Each painted eye gazes across centuries with quiet certainty. And yet, despite all we see, the greatest mystery remains. Where did they go? Did the refugees of Akrotiri find safety on Crete? Did they merge back into Minoan society? Or were they scattered like ash on the wind, lost to time, but remembered in myth? Some believe the tale of Atlantis begins here. Plato spoke of an advanced island civilization that fell to catastrophe, swallowed by the sea. A place of beauty and balance, undone not by moral failure, but by elemental force, a city whose echo still ripples in the minds of dreamers. Could Akrotiri be that memory, a thread woven into the tapestry of legend? Or is Atlantis something more, a symbol of the fragile brilliance of all human endeavor? Whatever the answer, the silence of Akrotiri teaches us something rare and sacred. It tells us that beauty need not last to be eternal, that a city can vanish, yet remain, that absence can hold as much meaning as presence, and that sometimes the wisest course is to listen to the earth, to the wind, to the subtle trembling that precedes the storm. As we leave this city of whispers, let us turn our gaze now to the divine figures who guided the Minoans, not kings, but women, not conquerors, but keepers of sacred knowledge. Let us meet the priestesses who stood at the threshold between world and mystery. There, in the corridors of night, beneath the flickering torchlight of sanctuaries and the open air of mountaintop shrines, walked figures draped not in the trappings of war, but in the robes of vision. The Minoan world was not ruled by pharaohs or war. Instead, at its spiritual heart stood women, keepers of ritual, interpreters of sky and flame. They were the daughters of the labyrinth. We see them not in throne rooms or on chariots, but in frescoes and figurines. Bare-breasted, their arms raised in invocation, they hold serpents as if they were threads of time itself. These priestesses were not symbolic, they were central. In the grand fresco known as the Labyrinth, we see the face of one such woman. She gazes out with painted eyes lined in black, her lips red, her hair coiled in ritual elegance. This is not the stylized art of submission or idealized femininity. This is presence deliberate, spiritual, commanding. She is not passive. She is priestess, oracle axis. The Minoans, it seems, lived in a world where the sacred feminine was neither peripheral nor hidden. It was the very thread that bound temple, sea, and star. This balance is striking when compared to the patriarchal structures that would come to dominate the ancient Mediterranean. While later civilizations built gods in the image of kings and warriors, the Minoans left us images of women in ceremony, women in power, women shaping the rhythms of sacred life. These daughters of the labyrinth moved in tandem with the seasons. They presided over believing rituals not as spectators, but as participants and guides. They held sacred vessels, poured libations, traced symbols in ash and oil. In their presence, the divine was not distant, it danced. The snake goddess figurines found at Knossos and other sites offer profound insight into this role, with serpents coiled around their arms and rising from their hands. These figures speak to regeneration, death and rebirth, the hidden wisdom of the earth. The snake sheds its skin. The priestess unveils the unseen. What names did they carry? We do not know. What prayers did they speak? They remain unrecorded. What stories did they tell in the temple shadows when the moon waxed full over the olive groves? All lost, and yet their echo lingers. The layout of Minoan palaces supports this matrifocal sacred order. There is no single grand throne chamber as in later palatial complexes. Instead, there are lustral basins, open courts, ceremonial stairways, and light wells that pour sky into ritual space. This was architecture for experience, not domination, for movement, not confinement. And movement is everywhere in the imagery. The priestesses dance. In the procession fresco, women and men alike move through corridors bearing offering. But always, it is the women who stand closest to the sacred. They are the bridge between mortal and divine. The labyrinth was their realm. Perhaps it was the loss of these women either by natural disaster, cultural collapse, or foreign incursion that marked the true end of the Minoan soul. For as the Mycenaeans rose in Crete, the imagery shifts. The feminine divine retreats. The priestess becomes subordinate. The language of ceremony grows silent. What had once been a world held in delicate, mystical balance begins to tilt. Yet the legacy of the daughters of the labyrinth would not vanish entirely. Their spirit would pass like wind through myth and memory. In the Greek tradition, we find Ariadne, princess of Crete, keeper of the thread that leads through the labyrinth. Though the story becomes one of love and abandonment, its roots reach deeper, to a woman who guided others through mystery. We remember also the Pythia, the oracle of Delphi, speaking in trance to kings and philosophers. She, too, is a daughter of this older world. And even today, in sacred rites that trace their origins to forgotten antiquity, women still invoke the earth, the moon, the labyrinthine journey of the soul. To honor these priestesses is to remember a civilization that saw the sacred not in conquest, but in connection. Not in hierarchy, but in harmony. Let us now follow the rhythm of their footsteps through time, into the rituals they kept with fire and flower, wind and wave. Let us wander now, dear dreamer, into the realm of the unseen, the sacred hours, when the Minoans lit their lamps and opened their hearts to the divine. These were not rituals imposed by fear, but dances of devotion, woven into the very breath of life. Flame and flower, scent and sound, water and wine all became offerings. In the Minoan world, where ceremony was not occasional, but continual, a sacred choreography of existence, theirs was a spirituality rooted in rhythm, in the movement of stars, in the cycle of seasons, in the opening of blossoms at dawn, and their closing by dusk. Every act could become a ritual if done with intention, reverence, and awareness of the eternal spiral. We find the traces of this sacred rhythm in their art. Frescoes show women holding lilies and crocuses, not as ornaments, but as offerings. In one image from Akrotiri, a saffron gatherer kneels beneath a blooming cliff, her basket brimming with golden thread. Behind her stands a goddess-like figure, seated on a stylized throne, receiving the gift with serene grace. Even flowers, it seems, could carry the soul toward the divine. In Minoan sanctuaries, rituals were likely held under open skies or in rooms designed to capture the changing light. Torchlit processions, hymns, sung to the rhythm of drums and flutes, and libations poured upon sacred stones. The acts themselves were simple, but the meaning ran deep. To pour wine into the earth was to feed the world's spirit. To burn oil in a lamp was to send light into the unseen. Consider the ceremonial hearths, where flames were tended with sacred precision. These were not mere sources of heat, but the living presence of divine fire. In some sites, circular pits and altars have been uncovered, blackened by centuries of incense, oil, and sometimes bones of animals offered in gratitude or supplication. Fire, in the Minoan world, was the messenger between realms. But their rituals were not only of fire, they were of water, too. In the palace of Knossos, lustral basins, sunken chambers, accessed by descending stairways suggest purification rite. Perhaps devotees would cleanse themselves before entering sacred space, anointing their bodies with oils, emerging into ritual with new skin and open spirit. Water and oil, ash and flower, these were the elements of Minoan devotion. No harsh doctrine, no command etched in stone, only acts of remembrance, connection, and beauty. And music, though no instruments have survived whole, we know from art that the Minoans used flutes, harps, and hand drums. We can imagine the sound of soft, steady rhythm rising in the hills at twilight, the voices of priestesses weaving into melody beneath the stars. Ritual, in such a world, would not have been something apart from daily life. It was the heartbeat within it. There is one fresco, found that shows a solemn procession, figures bearing vessels, walking in harmony, their faces calm, their steps unified. Some carry written conical libation vessels carved with bulls or seashells, used for pouring wine or honey into the earth. Others carry small altars. Their garments flow in elegant lines. Their presence is serene, not theatrical, but devotional. Even the bulliping, often misunderstood as spectacle or sport, may have been a ritual act, an offering of courage, a dance with life and death, with the bull not as enemy, but as sacred counterpart. To leap over the bull's back was to pass between worlds, to return changed, but all rituals must face silence. After Thera, something in the rhythm broke. The festivals continued, perhaps. The incense still burned, but the harmony had been disturbed. Trade had faltered, crops failed beneath dimmed skies. The gods, if they were listening, had grown quiet, and so the rituals became more desperate, or more hollow. In some sites, offerings grow stranger, tiny models of limbs, of animals, of hybrid beings, as if the people sought new ways to plead, to understand, to heal what had been wounded not only in the land. Still, they remembered the old ways. Still they lit the lamps, poured the libations, and danced. For ritual is not a thing that dies, is a liaticos. It clings to the stones and the soil. It survives in rhythm, even when memory fades. And tonight, in this contemplative space, we too are part of that echo. You, listening, in stillness. I, whispering across time. Together, we take part in the Minoan rite. To remember, to honor, to feel. Now, let us turn to the sacred spaces, where these rituals were born, not palaces or caves, but courtyards and terraces open to the stars, places where heaven touched earth and time moved in circles. Let us ascend now, dream or not, into towers of stone, but into air, into light, into the sacred courtyards and terraces of the Minoans, where the sky was not simply a canopy, but a presence, a witness, a guard. In a world that did not divide the spiritual from the natural, the Minoans brought their altars into the open. They built them in courtyards and upon rooftops, on terraces and mountain ledges. Altars, unroofed. These were places where ritual met the breath of the world, where wind carried prayer and starlight kissed flame. There, beneath the endless dome of the heavens, Minoan priestesses stood in robes of saffron and deep blue. They raised their arms not to command, but to receive. The gestures carved into figurines and painted into murals are always the same. Arms lifted, palms open, hearts turned skyward. This was not religionist, this was alignment. At Knossos, the central courtyard stretched wide between the eastern and western wings of the palace. Here processions would gather, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. In the morning light, incense curled skyward. At noon, shadows vanished. At dusk, torches glowed and the stars awakened. The courtyard was not only architectural, it was celestial. Each structure surrounding it was carefully aligned, not arbitrarily, but as some scholars believe the entire complex of Knossos was oriented toward the rising sun at solstice, or toward the stars of certain constellations. The palace, then, was not a fortress. It was a calendar, a mirror of the cosmos. And in the center, the altar. These altars were simple flat stones or platforms, sometimes ringed with pebbles or painted with sacred symbols. On them were placed offerings, bowls of wine, baskets of grain, petals of flowers, gathered at dawn, not to bribe the divine, but to harmonize with it, to remember the order of things. Outside the great cities, similar altars dotted the island slopes. At places like Petsiphus and Traustalos, peak sanctuaries overlooked the world. The wind was strong, the silence deep. Pilgrims climbed to these heights, bearing voters' miniature figurines of bulls, doves, or humans in prayer. They did not enter buildings. They entered presence. The mountain itself became the temple. Some of these sanctuaries offer expansive views over both land and sea. To stand there, with the waves behind and the valleys below, was to hold the world in one gaze. Here, perhaps, the Minoans traced the turning of seasons. Perhaps they watched the sun's long arc and whispered its names. Perhaps they awaited omens in the patterns of birds, or the quiet shifting of clouds. And when night came, the stars. The Minoans may have known the stars intimately. They needed no telescopes, only patience, only wonder, They saw the same constellations we do, yet knew them differently. Not hunters or warriors, but symbols of renewal, pathways, spirals. Their altars, then, were not places of sacrifice. They were instruments, lenses through which to view the eternal, tables upon which to place the symbols of gratitude, places where the human heart bowed to the mystery without fear. Even in Akrotiri, the frescoes show homes with flat roofs open to the sky, perhaps places of nightly devotion. The sacred was not confined to priests and temples. It lived in the architecture, in the daily gesture, in the way light entered a room at sunrise, and how wind moved across a terrace at dusk. It is easy to forget, in our modern world of ceilings and walls, that the sky was once the first altar. The Minoans did not forget, and when Thera erupted, darkening the sun and hiding the stars, it must have felt like a silence not only of the earth but of the heavens. What did they do, in that ash-thick air, when the altars of sky and flame were veiled? Did they still raise their arms? Did they still light the fire? Or did they fall into silence, waiting for the stars to return? We do not know, but we can imagine, and perhaps that imagining is itself a form of devotion. Let us descend now not into shadow, but into memory, into the great palace of Knossos, where the famous disc was found, a disc inscribed with symbols no one yet understands, a relic that speaks not in words, but in mystery. Among the wind-swept stones of southern Crete, where the golden plains stretch toward the shadowed ridges of Mount Ida, there lies a palace less famed than Knossos, yet just as profound in its silence. This is Knossos, labyrinth of light and stone, perched above the Mazzara plain, gazing toward the distant sea. It is here, in a quiet storeroom, buried beneath centuries of dust and wind, that one of the greatest enigmas of the ancient world was found, the Knossos disc, round, clay, modest in size, yet etched with spiraling symbols so precise, so deliberate, that they speak not merely of language but of invocation. Let us imagine the moment of its creation. A priest or scribe, hands stained with ochre and ash, takes soft clay and shapes it into a perfect circle. Slowly, deliberately, he presses symbols into its surface using carved stamps, each image clear, repeating, yet elusive. A plumed head, a ship, a flower, a labyrinthine swirl, a bird, 45 unique signs, arranged in a spiral, one inward, one outward, like the breath of the world itself. Then the disc is baked, hardened, preserved, and hidden. We do not know why. We do not know who. We only know it waited beneath the floor of a forgotten room, in the shadow of a fallen wallet, when it was discovered by an Italian archaeologist, Luigi P. And from that moment, the disc refused to speak. For over a century, scholars, cryptographers, and dreamers have sought to decipher its message. Some say, others, a magical incantation, a calendar, a legal code, a prayer to the goddess, or even the final lament of a dying people. Yet none have broken its code. Unlike linear A or B, the symbols of the disc are not carved by hand, but stamps suggesting the use of movable type long before Gutenberg's press, a printing technology in the Bronze Age, or simply an artistic tool. Even in that question, mystery lingers, but more mysterious still is its solitude. No other artifact like it has ever been found. No other clay disc, no matching stamps, no fragments of similar script. It is a voice with no echo, a message sent with no reply, and perhaps that is why it haunts us. For the Minoans, whose language remains unread, whose songs are lost to wind, the disc stands like a whisper from beneath the sea, saying, "We were here, we spoke, we dreamed." But what they remembered, we no longer know. And so we turn to the symbols. A woman in a robe, arms raised, a man running, a fish, a helmet, a labyrinth. They feel familiar and foreign, like dreams from a previous life. We recognize their shape, but not their meaning. Their silence is not empty, it is dense, like the silence of a temple after the flame is extinguished. The disc itself resembles a mandala, a wheel of time, a spiral inward toward mystery, or outward toward revelation. Some believe it represents a journey, spiritual, seasonal, ceremonial. Others say it is a game, or a song, or a map. But perhaps it is all of these things. Perhaps the Minoans understood that the most sacred truths are not linear, but circular, not declarative, but recursive. That knowledge is not merely what we can translate, but what we can feel. And so, the disc resists our analysis, but rewards our presence. Hold it in your mind. if not your hand. Let your thoughts spiral through its symbols. Do not ask what it says, ask what it stirs. The disc of Phaistos is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a doorway, a breath, a pause between knowing and wonder was the world of the Minoan. From the disc's spiral, let us now follow another path, one of rising influence and quiet transformation. For, as the Mycenaeans entered Crete, a shadow fell across the Minoan light. Not a conquest of swords, but of silence, of absorption, of forgetting. The silence did not come with a cry. It arrived slowly, like dusk falling across a summer courtyard. At first, nothing seems to change. The air still breathes with warmth. The frescoes still glow in golden light. The scent of olive oil and wild thyme still lingers. But gradually, unmistakably, the light fades, and with it, something more ancient begins to dim. This was the nature of the Mycenaean presence on Crete, not an invasion in fire and fury, but a transformation subtle as falling ash. Around 1450 BCE, archaeological layers across the island begin to shift. Palaces burn not all at once, but across time. Linear A, the mysterious script of the Minoans, begins to vanish, replaced by linear B, a script we can read. A language of inventory, rations, tribute. The sacred is replaced by the administrative. The poetic becomes practical. At Knossos, the palace is reoccupied, but it speaks with a new voice. The architecture remains, the frescoes endure, but the spirit within them changes. Where once there were priestesses, now there are officials. Where once ceremonies flowed in spirals, now bureaucracy sits in squares. The Mycenaeans were from the mainland. Their world was one of fortresses and warfare, of gold masks and stone walls. Their gods were thunderous and male. Their language bore the shape of early Greek. They came not to erase the Minoans, but to absorb them, to wear their culture like a cloak while tightening the thread of control. And yet, the absorption was incomplete. The old rituals did not vanish immediately. In some places, Minoan art continues, though altered. The women are still present, but less powerful. The bulls still leap, but more in image than in ritual. The labyrinth, once a space of initiation, becomes a prison for a monster in Greek myth. The story shifts. Ariadne, once perhaps a priestess of light and thread, becomes the daughter of a tyrant. The Minotaur, perhaps once a symbol of human-divine duality, becomes a beast to be slain. And Theseus the outsider becomes the hero. This retelling is more than myth. It is memory rewritten by the conqueror. But even so, traces of the Minoan soul resist erasure. At Chania, at Kamos, at hilltop shrines, still kissed by sea wind, the old gestures persist. Libations are poured, offerings are left. The Mycenaeans, perhaps, could not fully sever the sacred thread. Perhaps they, too, felt the power beneath the stones. But as the decades passed, the language of memory unraveled. Knossos fell silent around 1375 BCE. The disc was buried. The daughters of the labyrinth faded into story, and Crete, once the luminous heart of the Bronze Age, became one island among many. Its name remembered, but its wisdom forgotten. Yet even in this fading, there is mystery. Why did the Mycenaeans take Crete? Was it strategic, religious? Did they admire what they could not become? Why did they not build their own great palaces there? Why did they settle among the ruins? Some suggest the Mycenaeans were not invaders at all, but refugees from earthquakes, from famine, from rising instability, that they came to Crete not with fire, but with fear, and that the Minoans, weakened by Thera and economic decline, could not resist, nor, perhaps, did they wish to. In this version, there is no conquest, only collapse. Two civilizations in twilight, folding into one another as the stars grew distant. And so, the Minoan light flickered and was gone. But light does not die, it travels. It echoes, it reflects, and if we look closely, we can still see it in the myths of Greece, in the foundations of temples, in the spirals etched into coins and shrines long after the Minoan name was forgotten. Let us now follow that echo into legend. For even as the Minoans faded from history, they rose in myth. In a story so powerful, it shaped the Western imagination for millennia. Let us follow them into the tale of Atlantis. Beneath the surface of myth, below the shimmering veils of story told and retold, there lies a Memorath Beret, half burning, a city of light, a world of harmony, a fall as sudden as it was silent. We call it Atlantis, but perhaps, dreamer, it was once called Crete, or Thera, or something even older, whose name no longer survives in stone or script, but lingers in the rhythm of waves and the hush of ash. The story of Atlantis enters our consciousness through Plato. Writing in the 4th century BCE, he tells of a mighty island civilization beyond the pillars of Heracles, rich in wisdom, radiant in beauty, with palaces of gold and fountains of hot and cold water, teeming with elephants and fruits of every kind. But then, in a single day and night of misfortune, it vanished beneath the sea. For centuries, thinkers and mystics have searched for this lost world. Some point to the Atlantic, some to Antarctica, but other historians evoke to Thera, the island once known as Strong Isle, meaning the round one. Before the eruption, Thera was whole, a perfect ring of land encircling a calm lagoon, its cliffs steep and fertile, its villages rich and painted with joy. But then, around 1600 BCE, the earth opened, the sea boiled, fire split the island like an egg, the caldera collapsed, and the heart of Thera disappeared beneath the waves. The blast, by modern measure, was apocalyptic. Ash rose 40 kilometers into the sky. Tsunamis swept across the Aegean, drowning harbors and farmlands. Entire trade routes were ruptured. The sound alone could have echoed across continents. It is the most likely geological candidate for Plato's tale. But Plato speaks in allegory. He speaks of hubris and divine punishment, of a people who grew too proud, too detached from the sacred. Was this the Minoan fate, or was it something gentler, a fall not of arrogance, but of fragility? We see no signs in Minoan art of a people who worshipped power, no monuments to conquest, no glorified kings with swords raised to the sky. What we see is balance, a civilization built on trade, ritual, dance, and peace. Perhaps Atlantis is not a place, but a longing for what the Minoans once held. A world aligned with wind and wave, with flower and flame. A world where sacredness was not hidden in temples, but carried in the hand of a saffron gatherer. A world that vanished, not in vengeance, but in silence. And silence, too, is a kind of wisdom. Modern excavations on Santorini ancient Thera reveal the city of Akrotiri, buried in ash, yet preserved in astonishing clarity. Murals of dolphins, of priestesses, of joyful youth. Streets paved with volcanic stone. Homes with indoor plumbing and upstairs bedrooms. Is this not Atlantis? Not as fantasy, but as memory? Not as warning, but as reminder? For though Plato's account may mix myth and metaphor, something older flickers beneath his words, and that flicker marches the light of Minoan. Scholars note that Plato's description of Atlantis mirrors the Minoan world in many ways. Advanced architecture, peaceful society, island geography, sudden destruction. Even the concentric circles of Atlantis's capital echo the volcanic caldera of Thera before its collapse. Perhaps, then, Atlantis is the afterimage of the Minoan soul burned into the collective memory of a region, passed down through sailors, tales, and oral traditions, until it reached Plato's pen. And perhaps the legend remains, that beauty, when disconnected from humility, becomes brittle, that even the most harmonious world can vanish beneath the sea. That memory endures where stone does not. Even now, dreamer, if you walk the cliffs of Santorini at dusk, you may feel it, the hush beneath the tourist footsteps, the low hum of forgotten cities, the smell of sulfur mingled with sea salt, the way the wind turns cold without warning. Akrotiri lies beneath your feet. Atlantis, perhaps, beneath your dreams. From myth, let us now return to the earth, to the ruins themselves, scattered across Crete like pieces of an ancient mosaic. For even in their silence, these ruins speak. Time erodes most voices. It crumbles palaces, topples columns, scatters ashes across forgotten fields. But there are whispers that outlast centuries, embedded not in parchment or song, but in stone. On the island of Crete, where hills fold into one another like waves of time, the ruins of the Minoan world lie open to the sky. Not as skeletal remains of a dead civilization, but as fragments of me. Walk with me now through these remnants. Dreamer, let your thoughts slow. Let the hush of ancient wind guide your step. We begin at Knossos, the great heart of the Minoan world. Its foundation stones are broad and worn, smoothed by the centuries, yet still solid. Pillars rise in rich red, restored yet echoing the original grace. The floors are polished with ghostly footsteps. And here, if one listens closely, one may still hear the rustle of robes, the laughter of children in sunlit courtyards, the distant ring of bronze upon stone. The throne room remains intact, its low alabaster seat flanked by griffin murals, their wings curling into the air. Not a room of power, but of presence. The shallow basin before the throne speaks, not of conquest, but of cleansing, a place where leaders bathed in the sacred before speaking, where the voice was purified before it carried truth. From Knossos, we move to Phaistos, quieter, more contemplative. The palace clings to the southern slopes, overlooking the vast Messara plain, where crops once ripened in ordered fields. Phaistos whispers of balance, its stairways wide and flowing, its audience halls filled with light and wind. Here, the famous disc was found. Here, too, the stones seem to breathe. Then to Malea, by the sea. The ruins here are less restored, more weathered. Olive trees lean near broken walls. Then bees hum softly over thyme and wildflower. But even in ruin, the harmony remains. The storerooms are vast, designed to hold life's abundance. The central court opens like a heartbeat to the heavens. And further still, to Zakros facing east, the palace here is tucked into a cove, close to the lapping sea. Fewer visit, fewer disturbed. It is a place of dreaming. Rooms open toward sunrise. Aqueducts channel spring water through carved stone. This was not a palace of spectacle but of stillness. The sacred sea, always near, always listening. Even the villas, scattered in rural hills, speak of refinement. At Aja, Triada, walls still rise with Eliacha, and fragments of fresco cling like dried petals to sunlit stone. There is a dignity here require refusal to be forgotten. And then, beyond the visible ruins, the caves. At Psychro and Skotano, the stones do not rise, they descend. These sacred places were shaped by the earth herself, yet the Minoans entered them as they left votives, poured oils, lit fires, and though the fires have long since gone out, the soot still clings. The stones remember. In every site, in every scattered wall or cracked basin, there is a story. Not shouted, but breathed. Not complete, but true. These stones are not silent. They are waiting for us to slow down, to look without demanding answers, to touch without conquering, to listen. Modern archaeologists have uncovered much, but not all. The meaning of Linear A still eludes translation. The full extent of Minoan trade, belief, language, and loss remains clouded in the mists of time. And, perhaps that is as it should be. For the Minoans did not build to be worshipped, they built to align. Their architecture, their art, their altars, everything curved toward harmony, toward the center. The labyrinth was not a trap, it was a path. And so, even now, the ruins call us to walk, not to solve, not to conquer, but to spiral inward, to listen. The stones speak in cracks and shadows, in the warmth of midday light against a broken step, in the sound of your own breath as you move through ancient air. They say, we were here, we danced, we sang to the stars and the sea, we lived in rhythm, we vanished in silence. Now, dreamer, let us follow the thread of that silence as it weaves into deeper mystery, beyond the known, beyond even the ruins, lie fragments of language carved into clay words we cannot read, prayers. Let us explore that mystery next. In the world of the Minoans, words were more than tools of commerce or rule. They were vessels carriers of breath, memory, and meaning. They flowed like water across clay, curved like wind across stone. But today, that language lies silent, its voice broken into symbols we cannot yet understand. A song without sound, a flame without fire. This is the mystery of Linear. It is a script found etched into tablets, incised on votive offerings, and pressed into small jars and clay roundels each. These fragments have been unearthed across Crete and other Aegean islands, carefully preserved by archaeologists, studied by linguists, held in gloved hands in quiet rooms. And still, they do not speak. Not clearly, not fully, unlike its later cousin, Linear B, which was deciphered in the 1950s and revealed as an early form of Greek. Linear A remains unsolved. Its signs resemble those of Linear B in form but not in sound, not in structure. The key does not fit the lock. And so, we are left with a script that tantalizes, a sequence of lines, circles, dots, and loops. Some signs recur like mantras, appearing again and again across different regions, suggesting common rituals or standard phrases, yet others are singular, unique, the voice of one scribe perhaps writing in the dim light of an oil lamp, recording something sacred we will never fully know. What did these tablets contain? Some are clearly administrative tallies of goods, measures of oil or grain, accounts of land or labor. but others hint at more than economy. They were found in sanctuaries, near altars, beside figurines of goddesses and animals. Their purpose may have been sacred, prayers scratched into clay, sent to the divine with a breath of fire. We do not know, but we feel their weight. Each tablet is a frozen moment of voice that expected to be heard, and still might be, if not with the mind, then with the heart. Some scholars have suggested that Linear A may not represent a single language, but a family of dialects, a regional script adopted by diverse peoples across the Aegean. Others believe it was a liturgical tongue, a language reserved for ritual, echoing in temples but not in the marketplace. And some suggest it has no parallel at all, that it may represent a language isolate one with no known descendants, no living relatives, a tree whose roots were severed long ago, leaving only dry leaves on the ground. To read Linear A, then, is to stand at the edge of comprehension, to peer into a fog thick with memory, to reach toward a story that pulls away, and yet this very silence may be part of its gift. In a world flooded with noise, the mystery of the unreadable invites contemplation. It reminds us that not all things are meant to be solved, that some stories must be felt, not translated, that some songs can only be heard in dreams. In the shape of the signs, in their rhythm across the tablet, there is still beauty. Their flow evokes the spiral of the labyrinth, the curve of the moon, the way water carves itself through stone. They are symbols, in the truest sense, not just marks, but mirrors, and perhaps, just perhaps, the Minoans intended it this way, to speak not to the ears, but to the soul. Today, linguists continue their work, building digital corpora, mapping frequencies, comparing. The effort is noble. One day, perhaps, a Rosetta Stone will be found. The signs will resolve, the silence will lift, but until then, Linear A remains a lullaby sung in a language we no longer speak, and that, too, is sacred. Let us now turn from language to architecture once more, not in palaces or ruins, but in the homes of the common people. For the Minoan miracle was not limited to royalty or ritual. It lived in kitchens, courtyards, and communal wells. Beneath the grandeur of palaces and the silence of sacred caves, there burned a gentler flame, the glow of hearths, the quiet warmth of everyday life. While the frescoes of Knossos dazzle and the Phaistos disc puzzles, it is in the homes of the ordinary that the soul of Minoan civilization truly rests. In clay ovens and stone courtyards, in sun-washed thresholds and narrow village paths, the Minoans lived not as legends, but as people. Let us enter now, dreamer, into one of these homes. The floor is compacted earth, swept smooth by countless feet. The walls are made of sun-dried brick and fieldstone, plastered in white and red. A window opens to the breeze, draped perhaps with cloth or hanging over. In the corner, the hearth, a shallow depression ringed with stones, where a fire once danced beneath a bubbling pot. Here, bread was kneaded, olives were crushed, grain was ground between stone querns, rhythmically, as children played nearby or elders whispered seasonal wisdom to those who would listen. These were not houses of luxury, but of grace. Small niches in the walls held oil lamps, their glow soft and flickering at dusk. Jars lined the corners, some sealed with wax, others open to dry lentils, barley, or figs. Simple altars, barely more than a ledge or a painted stone, were tended with care. A flower, a shell, a splash of wine poured into the ground with a whispered invocation. The sacred was never far. Excavations in Minoan towns such as Gornia, Moklos, and Arcanes have revealed remarkably sophisticated dwellings. Many had 2 stories, some included rudimentary plumbing, with drains carved into floors to channel water away. Others had workspaces, loom weights, divats, storage, bins of evidence, that life and labor flowed seamlessly together. In the city of Gornia, often called the Minoan Pompeii, the layout is intimate. Narrow streets wind past clusters of homes, suggesting community rather than hierarchy. There are no massive fortifications, no glaring distinctions of wealth. Instead, there is flow between family and neighbor, between marketplace and household, between daily life and the eternal, and always, the hearth. In every culture, the hearth is more than a source of warmth. It is the center. The fire burns not only for cooking, but for gathering, for telling stories, for listening to wind on the roof and dreaming of the sea. We can imagine Minoan mothers teaching daughters to weave, not just cloth but memory. Fathers teaching sons to read the seasons, not from tablets but from trees and tides. Elders remembering a time before the eruption, when Thera still smoked gently on the horizon. And after Thera, perhaps the fire in each hearth burnt lower. Perhaps silence crept in, where laughter once rose. The economies struggled. Trade routes fell quiet. Fear, unspoken, lingered at the edge of thought. But still, the hearths remained. Still, they baked the bread. Still, they lit the oil lamps at dusk. Still, they offered their flowers and prayers. Even as the palaces faltered and the priestesses faded into myth, the hearth endured. These forgotten homes were the last to fall, not with war, but with weathering, with time, with the slow erosion that turns wood to dust and walls to shadow. Yet beneath the ground, the traces remain. Charcoal in hearth pits, broken cups beside thresholds, beads scattered in corners where hands once played, the archaeology of the ordinary, rich with quiet truth. And in this, there is profound reverence, for it is not only kings and queens who shape civilization. It is the weaver, the cook, the mother stirring lentils, the child chasing sunlight through a stone alley. It is the old man tending olives, the neighbor sharing water, the hands that set the table, each dusk in prayer and peace. They are not named in scrolls, they are not painted on palace walls, but they lived, and their warmth still rises in the stone. Now, let us return from these humble hearths, to gaze once more at the island itself, Crete, the land that cradled this civilization, the land that witnessed its rise and fall. Let us walk its cliffs and valleys and consider how deeply it shaped the Minoan soul. There are places in this world that seem touched by ancient breath, landscapes so imbued with memory that simply walking them feels like opening a forgotten book. Crete is such a place, an island not merely of stone and sea, but of spirit, a cradle in which the Minoan world was rocked into existence, and in whose arms it passed gently into silence. To understand the Minoans, we must understand Crete's shape, its rhythm, its elemental music. Long and slender, Crete stretches across the southern Aegean like a sleeping figure, its spine a range of mountains that rise and fall in sacred waves. The White Mountains to the west, the Ida Range in the center, and the Dictys Mountains to the east form the skeletal architecture of the land, rising abruptly from fertile plains and plunging into hidden gorges. It is in these uplands and valleys that the Minoans found their balance. The plains of Mazara, wide and sun-drenched, became the breadbasket of their world. Here they planted barley and wheat, tended fig trees and vineyards, pressed olives into oil that shimmered gold in ceramic jars. The land gave generously, and the people, in turn, honored it not by domination, but through rhythm. To the north, the coast welcomed ships from distant lands. To the south, rugged mountains guarded sacred caves and ancient herding paths. Inland, the land rippled with memory orchards, terraced hills, hidden springs, where goddesses once whispered to the wind. It is alive. It trembles with tectonic energy. It breathes mist into morning air. It sings with cicadas in the heat and whispers with owls at dusk. The Minoans did not seek to conquer it. They listened. They learned. They built with it, not upon it. Their palaces were not fortresses on high, but flowing complexes nestled into hillsides designed to align with solstices, to channel breezes, to honor the movement of light. Even the stones of Crete shaped their story. The island's rich supply of limestone, gypsum, and clay allowed them to build with elegance and permanence. Their pottery, found from the highlands of Crete to the Nile and Levant, carried the island's fingerprints far beyond its shores painted with spirals, waves, flowers, and marine life, echoing the shapes of their land and sea. The island's isolation was its protection and its vulnerability. It allowed the Minoans to develop a unique culture, unfortified, expressive, richly feminine, in symbol and tone. Yet that same isolation made them more susceptible to the aftermath of distant catastrophe. When Thera erupted to the north, Crete did not explode. It absorbed, the ash drifted slowly, the sea changed subtly, crops failed, earthquakes cracked foundations, and as the outer networks of Minoan influence withered, Crete endured. But even so, the island itself remains unchanged in its soul. The caves where they made offerings still exhale cool breath. The peaks where they prayed still catch the first blush of sunrise. The streams where they washed before rituals still flow between roots and rock. Today, when you walk the paths of Siluritas or gaze down from Mount Dictys upon the plateau of La City, you are seeing what they saw, feeling what they felt. The same clouds curl across the ridges, the same sun warms the olive groves, the same stars rise over the same mountains, It is no wonder that even long after the fall of the Minoan palaces, Crete remained sacred to later Greeks. They said Zeus was born here, that his cave still waits on Mount Ida, that the labyrinth was carved into its heart. But perhaps the truth is gentler. Crete gave birth not to gods, but to a people who lived in rhythm, who sang to the sea and danced in its shadow, who built their world in tune with their land, not above it. Crete was their beginning and their end, the cradle and the tomb, the song and the silence. Now, let us return from landscape to legacy. For even after the fall, the Minoan thread did not fully vanish. It was woven into Greek memory, into myth, into the architecture of dream. Let us trace that thread now, through the myths they inspired and the truths those myths may still conceal. When civilizations fall, their temples may crumble and their names may fade, but the stories remain, not always as facts etched into stone, but as myths, pliable and radiant, woven from memory and moonlight. Though their voices fell silent, their essence survived in tales whispered by those who came after. The myths of Greece, like fine linen, are threaded with echoes of Minoan grace. At the heart of these myths stands a name, Minos, the wise, stern king of Crete, a judge in Hades, a man said to have ruled a mighty island empire. Yet the Minos of myth may not be a man at all, but a memory of a sacred line of priest-kings, or priestesses, whose rituals governed the rhythms of sea and harvest, a name passed down like a title, repeated like a chant. Minos may not have ruled a labyrinth, but may have walked one, in ceremony and shadow, long before the myths were ever carved in verse. And then there is Ariadne. She is remembered as the daughter of Minos, the giver of the golden thread, the one who guided the hero Theseus through the labyrinth and into the light. Later stories tell of her abandonment on the island of Knossos, her marriage to the god Dionysus, her transformation into a star. But older still, behind the veil of myth, Ariadne may have been something more, a goddess, or a high priestess, radiant in saffron and silver, keeper of mysteries, mistress of the spiral path. Her thread was not just a talid, was symbol of fate, of return, of the soul's journey through confusion into clarity. The labyrinth was not a prison, it was a rite, and in the very heart of that labyrinth, half man, half bull, raging and imprisoned, slain by a foreign prince. So the Greeks told it, but what if this, too, was a reflection in a rippled pool? The bull, sacred throughout Minoan art, was not a monster but a symbol of power and renewal. The leaping bull, the dancing priestess, the double axe, they spoke a duality and transformation. Perhaps the myth of the Minotaur reflects a misunderstanding, a recasting of ritual into violence, of symbol into creature. To the Mycenaeans and the Greeks who came later, Minoan culture must have seemed both marvelous and strange, matriarchal, unfortified, obsessed with nature and rhythm. The myths may have arisen as ways to translate that wonder into their own language, a language more comfortable with heroes and monsters, with conquest and fate. Yet the labyrinth remains, not as a place of terror, but of reflection. Its spirals echo in temples from Crete to India. Its paths appear in medieval cathedrals. Its meaning shifts, but its presence endures. The thread of the Minoans was not lost. It was woven into Greek religion, into architecture, into ritual. Their columns were echoed in the Doric and Ionic forms of later ages. Their dances evolved into Hellenic festivals. Their reverence for the earth goddess blossomed into Demeter, Rhea, and Gaia. And in the silence of their language, in the curves of their art, something essential lingers. A sense that life is circular, not linear. That the past is never truly past. That what falls into shadow may rise again in myth. Even Plato's Atlantis carries their echo. A golden age, a mysterious form, a people of beauty and balance, undone not by evil, but by elemental shift. And so, the Minoans lived on, not only in stones and shards, but in story. Each myth is a doorway, each symbol, a key, each whisper of Ariadne, each echo of the labyrinth, is the past calling to the present, not as warning, to remember, to reimagine, to walk the spiral path once more. Now, as we move toward the closing chapters of our journey, let us explore what remains of Minoan art of Vivid. The fluid lines, the sacred images that still pulse with life across plaster and clay. Even when their language fell silent, even when their temples crumbled and their names were lost to dust, the Minoans left behind something that still sings, not in words, but in color, in gesture, in brushstroke. Across the fragmentary walls of Knossos and Akrotiri, in shards of pottery and delicate seals, the art of the Minoans lives on alive with movement, breath, and an elegance untouched by time. Step with me now, dreamer, into these painted halls. The walls glow in hues of ochre and crimson, lapis and cream. The light plays across images, not of war or conquest, but of life sacred, sensual, seasonal. Dolphins leap through curling waves in fluid blue. Lilies bend in springtime wind. Women with ringlets and kohl-lined eyes stride with poise, their waists narrow, their dresses flaring like petals. Men carry vases and lead bowls, not as conquerors, but as such. This is not decoration, this is devotion. The Minoans painted not to record history, but to echo the divine. Their frescoes do not depict battles, they depict harmony. Nature is not backdrop, it is participant. The line between human and world is blurred, soft, spiraling. Consider the Prince of the Lilies, whose slender figure and radiant crown have captured imaginations for decades. His gait is graceful, his expression serene. Perhaps he is not a prince at all, but a priest, or even a symbol of renewal, of sacred kingship, of spring emerging from shadow. And the bull-leaping fresco, vibrant with motion and mystery. A woman grasps the horns, a man somersaults over the bull's back, another waits behind, arms wide to receive. It is not a scene of violence, but of rhythm. The bull is not slain, it is danced with, celebrated. This fluidity is the hallmark of Minoan art. Lines curve like sea waves, figures move with music. Even in stillness, there is a sense of breath and color. Even after 3,000 years, the colors remain. They refuse to fade. At Akrotiri, the spring fresco covers an entire wall. Red lilies bloom in rhythmic patterns, reaching toward the ceiling like prayers. Swallows dart through the air with wings outstretched, their black and blue feathers delicate as wind. The scene pulses with life, eternal and effortless. This was not art for galleries, it was art for life, for ritual, for remembering what it means to be part of a world in balance. In pottery, too, the same motifs recur: spirals, marine creatures, palms, birds. In Comares, where found at Phaistos and Knossos, bold swirls and floral designs shimmer in white and orange against black backgrounds. The pots themselves are light, almost impossibly so, as if meant not just to hold oil, but to hold grace. The Minoan seal stones, no larger than a thumbprint, are engraved with astonishing detailed scenes of ritual, of animals at rest, of gods whose names we no longer know. These tiny objects once marked clay and flesh. They sealed doors and documents, prayers and possessions, and each one, even now, seems to hold a secret. What is most remarkable is that so much art survived, despite the fall. Because of Thera's eruption, the ash preserved murals that might have otherwise vanished, and though fire and earthquake consumed many palaces, portions of frescoes framed by ashlar stones and echoing chambers remained. And so, we see them now not as the Minoans saw them, not whole but enough. Enough to feel, enough to remember, and, in remembering, to recognize that they were not so different. They, too, loved color. They, too, honored the grace of the human body. They, too, looked at the sea with wonder, and painted what they saw not just with their eyes, but with their souls. Their art was not designed to endure, but it did. Because beauty endures where power fails. Because color speaks when language dies. Because in every curl of a vine, in every leaping dolphin and sunstruck lily, there is a truth that transcends words. We were here. We lived in balance. We saw the world as sacred. Now, let us leave the painted halls and step toward the sea once more, to trace the final tides that pulled the Minoan world toward its end. Let us contemplate how the last lights flickered, not in a single collapse, but in a gentle dimming until only legend remained. The end did not come with fire alone. It came like twilight, gradual, golden, aching, the soft fade of ritual, the slow closing of temple doors, the long silence where once drums echoed and voices rose in reverent harmony. The Minoan world did not fall in a moment. It dissolved. It dimmed. There was no last stand. No final battle inscribed in stone. Instead, there were shadows deepening in courtyards once washed in sun. There were hearths that ceased to burn. Storage jars left unfilled. Roofs that fell under the weight of neglect rather than war. By 1200 BCE, the palaces were abandoned. Knossos, which had withstood the aftershocks of Thera and the presence of Mycenaean scribes, fell silent. Phaistos no longer echoed with feet along its great stairways. Malia and Zakros became stones overtaken by wind, lichen, and time. And the labyrinth, the metaphor, and the Ria became empty. It is easy to picture it as a tomb, but perhaps it was something gentler, a retreat, a return, for even in the fading, the Minoan spirit did not resist. It did not lash out. It simply receded, like tide, like breath. The Mycenaeans inherited the husk of the Minoan world. They adapted its symbols, adopted its architecture, absorbed its beauty but not its soul. The rituals lost their rhythm. The gods lost their softness. The language of circles and spirals was replaced by the linear, the sharp, the administrative. Linear vanished. Linear rose and spoke only of rations and tribute. The sacred feminine, once so central, faded into myth, into Demeter and Persephone, into goddesses remembered only in shadow. But Crete remembered. The mountains and valleys still whispered the old songs. Shepherds passed down stories of caves where gods were born and labyrinths where monsters hid. The myths, though altered, preserved the pattern. And far away, in Athens and Delphi, in temples, raised by peoples who had never known the Minoans, twilight, after all, is not darkness. It is transition. The end of the Minoan world was not erasure, it was transformation. Into memory, into story, into dream. We find no tombs of kings, no Minoan pyramids, no epic inscriptions. But that is part of their mystery. The Minoans, it seems, were not concerned with being remembered. They were concerned with living rightly, in rhythm with sea and soil, in ceremony and joy, in dance, not domination. And because they did not try to outlast time, they became timeless. Their art endured. Their frescoes still breathe. Their symbols ripple beneath the myths of Minos and Ariadne. Their civilization, though vanished, planted seeds, not of empire, but of beauty, of balance, of sacred rhythm. As the labyrinth dims, the thread remains. Ariadne's thread, still unbroken, still winding through the chambers of memory. And we, dreamers of the modern world, follow it not to slay monsters but to remember wholeness. Now, let us take one final step in this journey, beyond myth, beyond stone, into the stillness where only the echo remains. Let us pass gently into the mystery that follows all endings. There is a moment, just before true silence, when the world seems to hold its breath, a stillness, deeper than quiet, a space between memory and forgetting. It is there, dreamer, that the Minoans dwell now, not in stone or language, not even in legend fully told, but in a whisper, a feeling, a presence. Walk through the ruins of Knossos or Zakros at dawn, when the sun has barely begun to touch the stones, and you may feel it, not a voice, exactly, but a sensation, a warmth in the air, a rhythm beneath your feet, the pulse of a world that has not truly vanished, but simply stepped aside. It is not easy to define, for the Minoans left no great proclamations, no statues shouting their triumphs across the ages. What they gave us was more subtle, more enduring, a way of being, of seeing beauty in the curve of a wave, of painting joy on walls instead of conquest, of honoring the earth with hands, not chains, of believing that the sacred was not elsewhere but everywhere. Their civilization was not perfect. No civilization is, but what remains is a glimpse of something rare. A society shaped not by domination, but by connection. To nature, to rhythm, to mystery. In this final breath of our journey, let us reflect on what we've found. We saw their homes not grand, but elegant. We walked their labyrinth, not a prison, but a path. We listened to their silent script not for translation, but for presence. We traced the arc of their rise, their ache, their fading, and we followed their echo into myth, where they are both lost and eternal. What remains? A spiral carved in stone, a dolphin leaping in faded blue, a disc pressed with symbols, still defiant in its mystery, a fresco of lilies blooming forever against an ancient war, and above all a whisper that says, live with reverence, move with rhythm, remember that you are not apart from the world, but a part of it. The Minoans are gone, and yet if you listen with your soul rather than your ears, they are not. They remain in the hush between waves, in the quiet spiral of the shell, in the hush that follows a dream. We are always walking the labyrinth, dreamer, not to escape, but to return, to the center, to the mystery, to the place where silence is not absence, but present, waiting to be felt. And now, as we draw the final curtain across this ancient sea-lit world, may the whisper of the Minoans settle gently into your thoughts, guiding you into stillness, into softness, into sleep. And so, dear dreamer, our journey through the silent fall of the Minoan civilization comes to rest. Let the final echoes of the labyrinth soften into silence. Let the warmth of ancient fires linger in your chest. Let the whispers of wind over Crete's hills carry you now, not into history, but into peace. The stories we've followed tonight were never meant to startle or astonish. They are like smooth stones beneath shallow water, subtle, steady, ancient. They are like petals from a painted lily, drifting through time with grace. We walked together through palaces without kings, through sanctuaries open to the sky. We met priestesses with outstretched arms and dolphins that danced on lime-plastered walls. We listened for the voice of a people who never raised their swords but raised their eyes, who built not to conquer, but to align, who vanished not in cruelty, but in quiet. As your breath slows, and your thoughts move like gentle tides, let the Minoan spirit hold you in its labyrinth of stillness. Let it remind you that you, too, are a thread in the great spiral, that even in your quietest moments, you are part of something ancient and vast. If this journey soothed you, let your spirit leave behind a gentle tracer like a share, a quiet subscription to the circle of dreamers who return each night to listen. Tell us, if you feel moved to do so, where you joined us from beneath the sky. Let us, across oceans and borders, become a new kind of Minoan, map-connected, thoughtful, quietly radiant. And when the world outside grows loud again, return to this place. Here, the flames are soft, the stones remember, and the labyrinth always leads inward, to rest, to peace, to dreams. Sleep well. May the whisper that remains guide you gently through the night.